on Sunday, Democrats finally passed the reconciliation bill. This was, unless you've been under a rock, you should probably know that this has been the culmination of a year and a half of negotiations on Biden's Build Back Better bill, which looked all but dead up until a few weeks ago. But over the course of 2021, the gigantic $6 trillion initial spending bill was eventually whittled down, mostly by corporations using a handful of politicians to knock out just about everything that touched any kind of public investment or was perceived as a threat to corporate profitability. And obviously, by the end of the year, with most of the power drained from the bill, it still wasn't viable for Manchin and Sinema. So now we actually have a bill that actually did pass, and we now have to ask what is in it. I'm sure that's the question on everybody's mind. And luckily, you have us who have read the New York Times debrief. So there is about $370 billion over 10 years in tax credits, much of which is aimed at people purchasing electric vehicles, utilities, and heat pumps. So in other words, a fairly indirect nudge towards some greater demand for whatever electric green commodities businesses decide to put out in this time. Some of that money will go directly towards businesses in the form of tax credits to encourage the creation of more solar panels, wind turbines, nuclear generators, and other low-carbon technology. But at the same time, as Matt Huber noted on last week's show, there's also quite a bit of an expansion of fossil fuel drilling provisions. So not really the Green New Deal we were hoping for, but whatever. You can watch the Matt Huber interview we did. In addition to all that, Medicare can finally negotiate with drug makers on the price of prescription medicine, but this will only apply to about 10 drugs, and this takes effect in 2026 and will expand to other drugs in subsequent years. There's also a $2,000 cap on out-of-pocket costs on prescription drugs for seniors. Would be great if we lived in a civilized society where we didn't actually need to have any out-of-pocket costs for prescription drugs for seniors. But
yeah, if the cap was $0.
Yeah, so it's good news compared to some other kind of horrible hellscape, but it's still an insane thing to say.
Yeah.
That's an insane sentence to read. There's also a $35 per month cap on the price of insulin for people on Medicare. The language for a $35 per month cap on the price of insulin for people not on Medicare was ripped out, thanks to Senator Sinema and others. There's also greater funding for the IRS, which Democrats say is going to crack down on rich people avoiding taxes, and Republicans say will crack down on the poor for just trying to get by, basically, with our horrible tax code. And finally, thanks again to our good friend, Senator Sinema. There's a new 15% corporate minimum tax on the profit companies report to shareholders. This would apply to companies that report more than $1 billion in annual income on their financial statements, but that are also able to use credits, deductions, and other tax treatments to lower their effective tax rates. So in other words, we're not taxing the actual people who pay very little in taxes. We're kind of, maybe, under certain conditions, going to be taxing businesses, but only, in a certain way where they can also just as easily write all this off and basically get their money back. So again, doesn't even touch profitability. Jen, will this save Biden's ass?
I feel like your recap of the bill kind of has hinted at your feelings on it, and I mostly agree, but I will say that I do think that just the act of them finally getting something over the finish line in the very, very short term probably will give them a slight boost. Or maybe another way of putting it is I don't think it could hurt. And the reason why I think that is obviously because the Democrats, not unjustly, are so often perceived as the party that's weak, that's incompetent, that can't stand up to the Republicans or fight a good fight, and that can't govern well. And so I think that this will be sort of useful in kind of shifting some of those perceptions, at least in the very, very short term. Now, over the longer term, I have to admit that I do worry, or I do feel actually pretty certain that this bill won't do anything or won't do much to build the Democratic base or reverse the ongoing and unfortunate and dangerous process of class de-alignment, which we've talked about many times before on this show. And the reason why I think this is basically all of the strongest provisions for working people, which were in the original bill, things things like the child tax credit, things like paid family and sick leave, things like universal pre-K, and even things like, like expanding free meals to students, to, grade school students. All of those things were stripped from the bill. That's basically what this 2-year process has been about, taking out all of those things. So you're left with a bill where the signature achievement is kind of these climate provisions, right? And as you mentioned, we have a whole video with Matt Huber on kind of the good and bad of those provisions. But the reason why this concerns me in terms of this bill and in terms of what it portends for the future of the Democratic base is that working class voters consistently say in opinion polls that they prioritize things like the economy, inflation, jobs, healthcare, climate change. I'm not saying that working class voters aren't concerned about climate change, but when you break down what people's stated priorities are, climate change comes up when you're talking to college educated and more affluent voters, right? So again, in terms of the kind of what this bill will do for Democrats and in terms of shoring up their base in the long run, I think it's only going to make the problem of class de-alignment worse if it has any effect on it at all. Your thoughts?
Right. Well, and on that point about climate change and about like what's actually in the bill, most of the spending is not actual public investment. It's not going towards actually transforming our energy systems or creating new, good jobs that have job security and like good pay that are like going towards actually building this all out. It's all at the consumption level. It's all for consumers. So it's if you have the money to buy an electric car. Well, that too, I guess. But
there's no subsidy for that in the bill. But
this machine kills climate change. I don't know, whatever. Yeah. But the car. An electric car, you probably, like, your working class people, even with the subsidy, the tax subsidy, are probably not going to be, and also, like, because you have to pay for it initially, and then you get the money back when you do your taxes. So, like, It's not really viable for most working class people. Like, this is not really a climate solution for the vast majority. It's mostly just something that, like, a middle class strata that has this income to be able to buy these things that green capitalists are putting out there. They then get a little pat on the back because you did a good job. You did your part to stimulate the green economy. And like, that's just not actually really that viable. And also, like, there's nothing in this that says, like, people will in fact buy these things. Like this, like the most optimistic estimates say like this is going to cut 40% of emissions from the 2005 level, but that's assuming that all these middle class people do the right thing, basically. So like it's just it's weak, it's bad industrial policy because like there's no we were talking about this last week in a different context, but there's no enforcement mechanisms. Right,
exactly. Yeah, and I want to go back again very quickly to the things that were taken out of the bill, because one of them that I mentioned was the child tax credit. And I do have to mention, in case people didn't see this, Bernie Sanders did fight to add an amendment to the bill to add the child tax credit back in. And like basically not just Republicans, Democrats got mad at him. Like members of his own party were like, Bernie, what are you doing? Now's not the time. And he was the only senator who voted to put that amendment in, which I think is, it is interesting and like shameful, not just because I think the child tax credit, the expanded child tax credit is a good thing, which obviously I do think, but it's a really popular thing, or it was. And it has always baffled me that the Democrats let that slide by. I know Joe Manchin had, his objections, but Joe Manchin has objections to a lot of things. And so again, that's just to underscore the fact that, not only is the centerpiece of this bill now these climate provisions, which, as you pointed out, like, are they actually transformative? Questionable. But all of the other stuff that would have actually, I think, spoken more to people's bread and butter, working class people's bread and butter concerns were just stripped out. So anyway, Cale,
Bernie, didn't you get the message that this was only things that business is okay with?
Right, yeah. No, I think he got it.
Yeah.
But Cale, any last thoughts on the reconciliation bill?
I agree with you. What you said earlier, that I think it's definitely good for Democrats to show that they got like a win on the board. That
For
like
once.
yeah, for once, so like Democrats can actually do something. The persistent problem is that like the change isn't coming until, in this case, 2026.
Right.
So for like the part of it that most people will probably actually feel, with the Medicare being able to negotiate prescription drug prices. So, I mean, I guess on the one hand, there's the persistent problem of like, the left still has to, like, the Democrats are not taking anything from the left right now. The wind is
Right.
still, like they have the power, but we still have like the platform that actually resonates with people, and so like we still have to do everything we can to like push that platform forward and say like we need to fight for things that are far more ambitious and actually far more reasonable based on like where people's living standards are and the crises that people are facing right now.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.